By engaging the world where there are hurts and needs, the church performs an important part of making the truth of God alive in the world. Social action and ministry is just one part of that, but it is important and a required outgrowth of our faith. Our theology, our worship, and our actions are all important. The faith of the people of God needs to grow and interact with the growing knowledge of civilization and the cultural concerns of God's people. Public theology needs to take the truths of God and make sure that they are alive and pertinent to people today and the contexts in which they live and struggle. At the same time, we need to make sure that what we are espousing is truly theology, an understanding of God and who God truly is. Public theology is not synonymous with social or political action. Christian doctrine and what God has revealed to us relate to the life of the needs of community in the world, but they are not synonymous. Christians should always be concerned about others, the marginalized, the oppressed, the needy. We need to think about how our doctrines and religious actions relate to and shape others. At the same time, we must never forget God who created us and whom we serve, and how our theology, our worship, and our actions communicate or obscure divine truth. Whatever we say or do as the church and as the assembled people of God is the church engaging culture. In the quiet hand of God, Wuthnow and Evans concede that everything done by the church is by nature a public act. However, their interest in that volume is in examining the activities that are done intentionally by churches to influence the public sphere and public policy. What we do should grow primarily out of love for God and love for neighbor. At the center of our engagement of society is all that our Christian assemblies and missions do across the globe, and the actions of all our members, whether done individually or especially corporately. As we act as Christians and the church, people and society see the church, and impressions are made. Our worship, our theology, our Christian lives are all lived out in public. Faith is simply not just a private matter. All that we do in public worship, teaching, and acts of mercy are all engagements, all public theology. Ronald Thiemann, author of Constructing a Public Theology, The Church in a Pluralistic Culture, defines public theology as faith-seeking understanding that relates Christian convictions to the wider social and cultural context in which the community lives. Faith is a public act, not a private one, as individuals are called before God to assemble in a faith community, serving and loving their neighbors, and reaching out to the world in which they live. Good engagement of the church and society is more than just reading or restating the gospel. Corporate worship, participating in word and sacrament, being washed at the font, and being sent out in service with others after being fed with the body of Christ are all foundational acts of engaging the world. Mission is not done in a vacuum devoid of worship and doctrine. Worship, doctrine, and mission are all part of our public witness. For public theology to be any less would be to foster a misunderstanding of worship, theology, and God himself. Unfortunately, all too often, congregations fail to reach far beyond their small community The gospel is read, the word is preached, and the sacraments are practiced. Yet the people of God in that place may not seem to be wrestling with their convictions in terms of social and cultural factors beyond their very own local concerns. And when I say local concerns, sometimes I mean the local concerns of that building. Like, the toilet's clogged, we need to deal with that. But what about what's happening down the street? What about the homeless person on the corner? Now, even if they're only dealing with local concerns, this doesn't mean that what they are doing is not public theology, as it is public action. It's out there in public, in a public place, where people are trying to discern how their faith impacts people in society, even in a small localized scale. It is public theology, just not public theology in all that it's called to be. Public theology and engagement of culture and society, like other aspects of the Christian life and walk, is something into which the people of God grow over time. Sanctification is a process. Public theology, then, truly is faith-seeking understanding. It is the people of faith trying to interact with the community and the world by putting faith into practice, given their own cultural context. It is important that those of us with a strong orthodox and biblical stand make strong efforts in reaching out to society and the world, putting our faith into practice. There are various so-called theological movements, taking their understandings and applying them to different social or cultural problems prevalent in a given community or the world. Sometimes a particular belief system will emphasize certain cultural issues to so great a degree that the greater theological goal of putting faith into practice amidst the social and cultural factors gets lost or at least clouded. In engaging culture, we must understand the balance in relating faith to the world, concepts to context, and theological knowledge to cultural experience. Sometimes the church may emphasize certain doctrines without proper, if any, care given to cultural concerns. At other times, theological movements can get so caught up in contextual issues that doctrinal understanding and convictions get lost in the increasing morass of individual and contextual issues. You may find some solace in the fact that there are those within liberation theology circles calling their proponents to focusing on balancing convictions and context. As we seek to balance Christian doctrine and Christian duty in the community and the world, Thieleman's work is again quite helpful. He explains that Christian communities often fall on one of two ends of the spectrum, and in some ways they are analogous to Niebuhr's extreme typologies. At one end are those who see the Christian faith and worship as a political tool. In the most exaggerated of these circumstances, every action of the church is done in terms of what it can accomplish socially and politically. Perhaps this is the danger of the approach of Wuthnow and Evans I mentioned earlier. For if the chapters and examples in their compilation are looked upon as a checklist or pattern of action by the church, the people of God would be active in society, but they might not be giving enough emphasis to the truth of God and the Christian faith. On the other end of the spectrum are those Christians and assemblies who seek to separate themselves from society and focus on the Christian community and what it is called to be, without concern for the world and the civic community. Here, Thieleman gives Stanley Hauerwas as an example. while we might not agree with Theman's example, we are reminded of the importance of balancing Christian conviction with the needs of God's people in our communities and throughout the world. If we are going to do our duty in the world, we need to understand who God is and the divine plan for people and the world, and communicate it clearly. At the same time, if we are going to truly learn, practice, and apply the truths of God, we need to understand the communities, cultures, and the world in which we live and act, and which we are called to minister. That way, we may serve both God and neighbor faithfully. The church engaging culture is a continual process of holding these things in proper balance, with God rightly first.